It is no mystery, we're winning victory. Now tell me something, Mr. Police spokesman, tell me something. How long you really think we would have take your button lift, the jackboot kick, the dirty bag of trick on you?
Yes, we are making history and that's no mystery, and we are winning a victory this afternoon on Capital Radio 100.4, the sound of a new generation. And good afternoon to all the beautiful listeners tuning in right now. I have a guest this afternoon in the studios, a respectable man for that matter, a man who won some prestigious awards in poetry. He's a revolutionary poet ranging from international and national respectable institutions like universities, colleges, government institutions, and then organizations. He collected many awards in England and also his country of origins in Jamaica, even in Africa, in South Africa, where he was awarded an honorary doctorate in literature. So this man did a lot in literature. He did a lot in promoting black culture, revolutionizing black music, black poetry, and also uplifting black people, and a tremendous work for the human race for that matter. And he is no other than Limton Kwesi Johnson, LKJ, the living legend. He's my guest this afternoon on Capital Radio. And welcome, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes, nice to have you in our midst.
I'm very happy to be here. It's my first time in the Gambia, and it's beautiful. I love it.
Okay, let's take it back. Well, let's go down the memory lane. Born in Jamaica, in Chapelton, a rural town, Paris, in the rural area, in Clarendon, Jamaica, moved to London in 1963 at a tender age. During that era in our developmental history as black people, the fight for independence in Africa was imminent. Many African countries were getting independence. Some were fighting to have independence but don't attain it. And you have some black movements in America and UK fighting for the uplifting of black people. People in UK were on the forefront fighting for more freedoms, greater rights. How was it like for you being in UK at a tender age and then being in such a situation?
Well, I went to England when I was 11 years old, and in a child's imagination, you think the streets of London are paved with gold and everything is fancy and fabulous and wonderful. But it was a rude awakening when I got there and saw that the black people were living as third-class citizens, that white working-class people were not so different in their situation from a lot of black people, and that we were not welcomed with open arms. We were going to the mother country because we were colonial subjects of Great Britain, and we were going to the mother country to help with the business of reconstruction after the Second World War, but we were not welcomed. In fact, we found ourselves in a very racially hostile environment, and we had to organize ourselves to have some human rights, to have some civil rights, and to have some power.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Being in those civil rights movement, you were there on the forefront fighting, and you choose poetry. Why did you choose poetry as an art to propagate your message?
Well, I don't know how to answer that question, but the best way for me to answer it really is to say that poetry chose me. Mm-hmm. When I became a teenager, in my late teens, I became politically conscious. Mm-hmm. I became politically conscious because I was affected by the movement, the Black Power movement that was sweeping both sides of the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. And I joined the Black Panther movement. Mm-hmm. We were a very militant organization. Our slogan was Black Power, People's Power. Mm-hmm. And our fight was against our marginalization in British society. Now at school in England, I didn't come across any literature, any poetry, in which I could find my own experience, in which I could find myself. There was nothing about me in the English school curriculum. But in the Black Panther movement, for the first time, I discovered something called black literature. Mm-hmm. Because up until that point, as a schoolboy, I didn't know that black people wrote books. And it was a big revelation for me. And I came across one book in particular. It was a book called The Souls of Black Folk by the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. And this was a book about the experiences of African Americans in the post-emancipation period in the United States and how they were getting on and so on. And even though this book wasn't a book of poems, it was prose, the language was very poetic. It was some of the most beautiful poetic prose I've ever read. And that book moved me and stirred something within me and made me want to articulate how I felt about my experiences and the experiences of my generation of black youth growing up in a racially hostile environment. And so for me, in the beginning, poetry was not about art or artistic expression or anything like that. For me, poetry, writing poetry was a political act. And the poetry itself was a weapon, a cultural weapon in the black liberation struggle.
Yes, you named here the Black Panther movement. Was it an extension of the Black Panther movement that we were seeing in America those days?
It was a different organization, completely independent of the Black Panther Party. In America, it was the Black Panther Party. In England, it was the Black Panther movement. And we were mostly based in London, although we had some connections with other organizations in Birmingham, Nottingham, Manchester, other parts of England. We were an independent organization, but we were inspired by the Black Panther Party of the United States of America, and we had some relationship with them. For example, we would sell their newspapers, and I think on a couple of occasions we had speakers come over to England to speak. You know, I think we had Angela Davis at one time. But we were independent, but we believed in the same thing. And we more or less adopted the same line and the same political position as they did. Of course, we didn't walk around with guns in our communities because guns are illegal in England. But we completely understood why they had guns in the United States to protect themselves against, black people being murdered by racist police officers and so on. But the Black Panther Party in America was a very important organization, not only ideologically, not only in terms of organizing and mobilizing black people. It also served a social function. For example, they had a breakfast program where they fed children who were from poor families and who went to school hungry, and a lot of health and educational support for people from black working class communities and so on. That was in America. The Panthers in England, we were more about raising people's consciousness and organizing people to fight for justice. Whether it was about employment, whether it was justice in the courts, justice in the educational system, and so on. And that's where I learned my politics. We studied several books. One was The Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois, very important book. The other book was The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. Jamz. Now, The Black Jacobins is about the first slave rebellion which became a revolution in Haiti, in the Caribbean, which established the first independent black republic in the world at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, led by Toussaint Louverture. Of course, Haiti is now, even today, paying the price for the freedom of black people, because the revolution in Haiti preceded the abolition of the slave trade. In 1804, there was a country, a black republic called Haiti. The slave trade was not abolished until 1807. And slavery itself wasn't abolished until 1838. So black people in the Caribbean, in the Western world, we owe a lot. Maybe also here in Africa, we owe a lot to the heroic struggles of the people of Haiti. Another book we studied in the Black Panthers was a book called The Making of the English Working Class by E.P. Thompson. And this was a book which documented all the different movements of the peasants and the working class people, the labor movement, and how white working class people organized themselves against oppression in their own native land. So that was an important foundation, educational foundation for me. I didn't get that in school, you know, and it set me up, stood me in good stead over the years.
I can see this is why Haiti is living in abject poverty still nowadays.
Absolutely.
They were the first people to revolt against the system. Now,
not the first people to revolt, the first people to have a successful,
the successful
revolt.
Yeah, good. Now, when we look at your work, you read many books, you wrote many poems, you did a great work in literature, because I understand you are among the people, I can say, even the first black man to be, his work to be published in the Penguin Modern Class series. Then, how did you take poetry and then take reggae music and then use reggae music as a vehicle to send your poetry messages, revolutionary messages or political messages?
Okay, well, my first love was always music. Even before literature, my first love was music. As a schoolboy, I used to collect all the latest records from Jamaica, all the latest rocksteady, and then later on reggae tunes, you know. And when I began to write poetry at first, I used to write in English. And I found that the English language was inadequate as a vehicle to express what was basically the African Caribbean experience in Britain. And I thought to myself, well, why use the rarefied language of classical English poetry or the poetry of the English canon to express myself? Why don't I do so in the language of my people? And I was listening to and reading some African American poetry. And I remember I read a book called Black Poetry Now, edited by Dudley Randall, published in America. And it had all these African American poets, you know, like Langston Hughes, Amiri Baraka, Gwendolyn Brooks, Jane Cortez, and so on. And so I came across some poems where the everyday spoken language of African Americans was used for poetry. And then I was listening also to the early reggae DJs from Jamaica who were doing, chanting spontaneous improvised lyrics over the instrumental version of a reggae recording. People like Big Youth, U. Roy, Prince Jasbo, and all these pioneering DJs. And I also got a recording of poetry accompanied by percussion by a group of poets in America called the Last Poets. And they were using the language, the everyday language of African Americans as a legitimate vehicle for poetic discourse. And then later on I also found out that the mother of Jamaican poetry, a woman called Louise Bennett, wrote in the Jamaican Creole, the Jamaican dialect. So that pointed me in the direction I wanted to go, and I began to write my verse using the Jamaican vernacular, Jamaican speech, or what some people call Jamaican English, but I prefer to call it just Jamaican language. And music kept on intruding in my writing. I was hearing music when I was writing the words. In other words, I became interested in the musicality of the very language itself. And I used to recite my poems in those days in my local youth club, in the local community center. Back in those days, if you had 15 people at a poetry event, it was like a huge audience. You know, it was fantastic. And people kept on saying to me, your poems, you know, they sound very musical. Why don't you put them to music? Anyway, to cut a long story short, I was at university studying sociology, and Virgin Records began to become involved in exploiting reggae music. And there was a guy called John Varnum who was a teacher in Brixton, and he was a musician also, a white guy. And they hired him to make adverts, to do the marketing side for them. And this guy, John Varnum, he knew about me as a poet, so he contacted me and asked me to come and help with the marketing campaign. So I was writing copy for the adverts, writing sleeve notes for the albums, and I was a student of reggae anyway, so I was writing biographical notes and all that. So one day I said to him, you know, I write poetry and people tell me it sounds very musical. Why don't Virgin Records give me a chance to make a record? He said, okay. So they gave me £300 back in those days. I mean, I was chicken feed. And we went to a little small recording studio, 4-track studio, with some school friends of mine who happened to be musicians. One guy, Winston Kearney, he was a drummer, he's dead now. Vivian Weathers, he played the bass. And then they said, well, we can do something, you know. And we went to the studio and we recorded 4 tunes. So we brought it back to Virgin and they listened to it, and a meeting was arranged between myself and Richard Branson, who was the boss of Virgin Records in those days. And he said, oh yes, I like what you're doing. You know, in those days it was punk rock, and punk rock ruled the roost. Sex Pistols was the biggest band on the label. And he said, yes, we like what you do, and we can give you a chance to make a record. Here is £2,000, go and make your record. So my friend Vivian Weathers, who I went to school with, said, well, Linton, if you want to make a good album that sounds like reggae, you have to use a guy named Dennis Bovell. Dennis Bovell is, everybody thinks he's Jamaican, but he's actually from Barbados. And he was the best engineer, recording engineer around at the time for reggae music, because the white reggae recording engineers, they didn't know how to record the drum and bass properly, because in reggae, everything is built around the drum and the bass, and you have to have the right kind of sound. And Dennis Bovell used to be a sound system operator. He used to operate a sound system called Sufferer's Hi-Fi. So I said, okay, I found this guy, Dennis Bovell. In fact, how I met Dennis Bovell, I was doing some freelance reporting for the BBC overseas service. You know, whenever a reggae artist came to London, I would track them down and get a tape recorder and go and try and get an interview to earn some money, pocket money. And one of the bands I interviewed was Matumbi. That was Dennis Bovell's band, because he was also a musician with a band called Matumbi. And I said, I'm going to make a record one day, and I hear that you're the best engineer, you know. He said, yeah, whenever you're ready. I'm at Gooseberry Studio in the West End. So we linked up and we made the record, Dread, Beat and Blood. Recorded it in 1978. It came out in 40 years ago. And it was released on Virgin and was voted the best reggae album of the year by one of the music papers, music magazines. I think it was Sounds magazine or something. And then my career just took off, just like that.